For several years, a black and white banner hung over Fifth Avenue from an upper story flagpole at the NAACP's headquarters in Manhattan. The 6 by 10-foot banner read, "A man was lynched yesterday," in bold typeface. The banner was removed in 1938 after the NAACP's landlord threatened them with eviction. This haunting reminder of the material conditions of Black folk living across this alleged land of the free during the Jim Crow era. This banner, this understanding has shaped my understanding of violence, whether it's carried out by an angry mob or an institution or the hands of the state and its representatives. Today, Good Friday, is another haunting reminder of this reality. There is nothing polite or comforting about the story of the crucifixion of Jesus of Nazareth. Perhaps that's a sensation we ourselves get when watching and hearing and reading the latest news. Good Friday is a day of sweat and tears and wine and blood and water poured forth. A day of brutality and abject horror as the teacher from Galilee's story transforms from that triumphal entry into Jerusalem to dragging his cross to the place of the skull, where he is nailed to the hard wood of that cross and lifted high above the crowds of people who jeered and taunted him as he was flogged and abused. There is next to nothing good about a Friday where the power of empire is offensively on display, where state-sanctioned violence takes center stage. This execution was a spectacle for all to see and celebrate. And more, it was a loud and obvious warning of what happens to those who challenge empires and institutions, what happens to those who call out the scramble for power when the state and religion form a malignant alliance. Crucifixion was, and lynching is, an admonition for those whose lives and teachings and actions and testimony might look a little too much like dissent, sedition, insurrection, or revolution. Leaders of these powerful institutions would have us believe that state-sanctioned violence is the penalty and the punishment for speaking honesty and bold truths about those material conditions, for criticizing those violent mechanisms of institutions that degrade or oppress or annihilate anyone who dares not conform, comply, or obey. Violence is the main character in the Good Friday story. And let's be real for a second. The story can be hard to hear when we live in a nation that has an addiction to violence. Not a day passes when our news headlines aren't flooded with yet another act of cruelty. We constantly hear of trans folks who are murdered or kill themselves. Stories of vulnerable people killed by intimate partners or family members. Stories of Black folks lynched by overzealous, over-empowered police officers who receive training that is equivalent to those serving in the armed forces. Stories of thousands upon thousands upon thousands of Palestinians killed by their occupiers and oppressors who, quite honestly, seem dead set on the complete annihilation of indigeneity in Palestine. All while the United States funnels billions and billions into a genocidal state. Yet those who dare to speak candidly and honestly about this very complicated situation are then expelled from their universities or have their visas revoked, or they're disappeared and plucked out of their families and communities to be sent to far-off detention centers only to be shuffled around in the bureaucracy of criminally unjust threats of deportation. Not to mention Gilmar Abrego Garcia, who gets deported to CICOT, the Salvadoran Terrorism Confinement Center, as someone puts it, that black hole of human rights, under false claims that he's a gangster, despite a court ruling saying that he's not. And of course, there's all these people in red hats celebrating these intentional acts of violence, many of them claiming to love and follow that seditionist preacher from Palestine who sat in the synagogue of his hometown Nazareth and opened the scroll of Isaiah and read, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because the Lord has anointed me. He has sent me to preach good news to the poor, to proclaim release to the captives, recovery of sight to the blind, to liberate the oppressed, and to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." Jesus' sermon in Nazareth didn't celebrate state-sanctioned violence. It was one that decried the violence of the world. It promised good news for the poor, the downtrodden, the disinherited, the broken, the hurting, those wounded by the death-dealing oppression and economic justice of their time. It said to those listening, not just those hearing, that they had the power to reorder society, to redistribute wealth, to create economic justice. And I think that if Jesus preached this today, his teaching would be to end lynching, to end racism and sexism and homophobia and classism and ableism, anything that sets us apart. He would teach us to dismantle the mechanisms of oppression, to eliminate capitalism and militarism and empire and all of these notions of supremacy. And I think that if he taught all of this today, shared this good news for the poor throughout this land of the free, that he would almost certainly be betrayed, handed over, and arrested for disobedience. And the state would still hang him upon a cross or a tree or any number of creative things that the bloodthirsty war criminals who lead the world could dream up. Friends and pilgrims, we don't gather on Good Friday to celebrate death. We don't envy Jesus' suffering. We don't laud that violence. We don't romanticize the instruments of death, whether they be crosses or ropes or guns or mortars or electric chairs or the fists of a loved one. We don't rejoice that they killed Jesus for being a good teacher and a threat to the empire's power structure. And we needn't theologize that God needed us to kill Jesus so that she could love us. None of humanity, not one person, none of creation is so bad that Jesus needed to be a scapegoat for the sin of all humankind so that God can be close to us. The shadow of the violence of the cross that lingers over Holy Week and especially Good Friday should be the shock we need to wake us up, to make us perceptive and responsive to the violent injustices of our world and to rage over that violence, that domination, that misuse of power. I think we're entitled to that anger. We're living in a timeline where those who sit in the privileged seats of power seek to control us, to force us into our silos, separating us from our neighbors and friends and comrades. They seek to dehumanize the other, the rebel, the poor and the distraught, as well as good teachers. Also, we might look at each other with skepticism or disdain. They try to make us think that the real problems making people suffer are sex workers and pronouns and trans people who just need to use the bathroom. They want us to believe that the American dream is unraveling because of the woke left and immigrants and professors and DEI and human rights and the working class and those homegrown criminals, whoever they are. They want us to redirect to prevent us from seeing all that the unbridled exploitation of capitalism, that the state-sanctioned violence, and that the sharp, unfettered rise of oligarchy and fascism will continue to destroy the lives of those that Jesus would gather around his table and feed. I need all of us to remember that despite the threats of violence and abuse and oppression in those headlines that dominate our minds and our time, the most important thing we can do is come together. Remember this Ethiopian proverb: when spiders unite, they can tie down a lion. Friends and pilgrims, we have to pray together. We have to learn together. We have to grow together. We have to protest together. We have to stand in solidarity together. We have to fight back together. We have to break the chains of oppression and the yoke of injustice and set the disinherited free together. We have to love together. And because we live in a world that's addicted to violence, we also have to gather at the foot of the cross and mourn and grieve and rage together. Only then can we imagine a world free of violence together. Amen.